Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Tonight, we're delighted to welcome Professor Stephany Biello of the University of Glasgow, and she is a neurobiologist. She's going to be talking to us tonight about the importance of community within the Catholic faith. So it's great that everyone can be here tonight as a community, and hopefully those of you joining on YouTube are welcome. Well, you're welcome too. Now, Professor Biello is going to be talking to us very much from a neurological, a scientific point of view, which we hope will be a welcome change and something unique. So, Stephany, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak this evening. And I'm really sorry that I couldn't join you in person. I have collaborators at Oxford, and I've been down a number of times, and it's a lovely place, and I wish that I could be joining you. But I'm pleased that we're able to get together virtually. So as Rebecca said, I'm a neurobiologist and I'm an educator. At the University of Glasgow, I'm a researcher, and I've been head of my unit of neuroscience and psychology, and I'm now Dean of Learning for Science. So I'm also a Catholic, a wife, and a mother, and I'm always growing in my Catholic faith and learning more in my discipline of neurobiology. So I don't pretend to be an expert on Catholicism, but you have your expert in your priest to lead you. But the area where I know quite a bit about is the biology of us as creatures. And so I want to share a little bit with you today about my journey and highlight the beauty and the excitement of how this illuminates aspects of why relationships and community are so essential, as well as sort of how they work on a neurobiological level. So there's going to be a significant amount of talk about the brain and how it's involved in behavior. So if at any time I use a term that you're not familiar with, make a note and ask, and there really are no silly questions here. And there will be room at the end for you to ask some questions and hopefully maybe for us to have some discussion. So to start, what I'm not going to talk to you about is aloneness. So I do recognize the importance of this. My topic that I'm talking about tonight grew out of a conference that I gave at the Casa in Rome, and that's the House for Postgraduate Study for priests from the North American College. And it was on the theme of community. And I told them the fact that I was not talking about aloneness wasn't because I didn't recognize that it was important, and I know that it is very important. And so I have a quote here from St. John Paul II. It can be said those unable to have a positive experience of their own solitude are incapable of genuine and fraternal fellowship. And I think that's something to really keep in mind. You can't be afraid of your solitude with Jesus. That comes first, and it's a prerequisite. I told them that my experience, certainly with priests in Scotland, was that they do solitude really well. You see them doing holy hours in the churches, praying and reading. But what you see less and hear less about, more obviously, is fraternal community for them. And I feel the same way sometimes for students. And I think, it's true. It's really possible to busy yourself with everything, from social media to your studies to activities in clubs and societies. And I see a real ability within our students to focus and work on their own personal growth, trying to get their own house in order. But in grouped activity, sometimes I see that proximity doesn't necessarily mean community. And that's because it can be a real struggle for us to be vulnerable how we need to, as fallen men and women. That can be a struggle for us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide what I'm going to talk to you about into a couple different parts. I'm going to talk to you about relationship and community, how it's central to the faith. Evidence from a biological perspective that we need community. Then we're going to talk about some characteristics and things that make a strong community and relationship. And then some practical ways to encourage community, tying it into the Catholic faith, which I think is great at doing this. We have really, really good tools that can really encourage and foster our community. So to start off, relationship and community is central to our faith journey. So years ago when I was studying in Canada, I knew a very holy monk, and I knew he really concentrated on his personal holiness, and he was really drawn to life as a hermit. And although he valued his individual prayer life and his personal relationship with Christ, and there was the opportunity actually for him to take advantage of this because of the order that he lived in, but he never did. And so once I asked him why he never pursued any time in that sort of hermetical life, and he responded, "If I did, whose feet would I wash?" And he said he didn't take credit for that, but it had been articulated originally by St. Basil the Great. And when he elaborated on it, he explained that to be fully human, he really needed the struggles and joys of living in community. So I'm not going to talk to you about washing each other's feet, although Jesus did wash the feet of the disciples. And, the ceremony of the washing of the feet is still practiced in the Catholic Church, and it is undoubtedly beautiful. I'm going to talk to you about how to be fully human and make a case that the way that we establish that is through our relationships and community. So I remember when I was younger, I remember reading in Genesis and being struck with a pattern. So God made this and it was good, right? Nice smile, all warm and fuzzy. Then he made that and that was also good, reading along. And then suddenly being jarred by God saying something was not good. And I remember thinking, wait, what was that? I thought everything was good. What's going on here? And then God says, it's not good for man to be alone. And there's that not good. So you think, what's the implication of that? God says he made man and it was good. Remember, they were in fellowship. They were walking in the garden in the cool of the evening. Perfection, right? Not exactly. I remember thinking, what exactly is going on here? Man is not alone. He has God. And isn't that enough? But God is saying he created us so that we need each other. And this has been inbuilt in how to be human from the very beginning. I mean, it would be absolutely scandalous, right, if anybody else was saying it but God. So what does God do? He looks about. No suitable helper is found, says in Genesis 2. And in English, the word help, that has a really broad range of connotations, right? You can help somebody because you open the door for them. You can help them, you can help them in a myriad of different ways that are very simple. Or it can refer to something that's much more vital and significant. So think of like the help that you would get, for, say, provided by a doctor, something that's really vital. So in Hebrew, the word helper used in Genesis 2:18 and 20 is azer. And it's always and only used in the Old Testament in the context of vitally important and powerful acts of support. So the noun azer is used 21 times in the Old Testament. Twice it's used in the context of the first woman. 3 times it's used in people helping or failing to help in life-threatening situations. 16 times it's used in reference to God as a helper. Without exception, these biblical texts are talking about a vital and powerful kind of help. So the helper God created served a vital and powerful act of rescue and support. And this is what we are to each other. So this is something that I think can really be missed in our dominant culture of individualism. I said previously, I spoke to some priests in Rome last year about the role of community. And one sent to me when I came back from that trip, sent me a great book called The Religious Sense by Luigi Giussani. It opened up his perspective on community, and it's really kind of framed my thinking over the past year. And further, there's been a huge biography on him recently published, written by an Italian, so it's got to be at least a couple hundred pages long. I've only read about half so far. Luigi Giussani was a priest. He was a theologian, an educator, and a public intellectual who lived in Milan. And he passed away in 2005, and he's a huge and important figure, really. He perceived in such a way that he saw through things and I think really saw elements of the future. He saw where things were going. He saw the damage that secularization would do. There's so many facets to his message, and I'm absolutely not an expert on him. But for today, I'd like to raise just part of his message. He really put community back at the center of the religious experience, not secondary, but really at the heart of the encounter with Christ. And it happens most profoundly within the context of community. So we see this in the intimate relationship. We see this in the intimate relationship of the Trinity. I participated in discussions where striving for personal holiness is sort of put on one end of a spectrum, and at the other end, they're talking about community bringing us to personal holiness. And I think I don't think that's really setting it up right. I think they're not opposite ends of a spectrum. For most of us, personal holiness and community are going to be intimately tied. We exist in relationship. In the West and in our culture of individualism, I think we can miss this. And in the biography, Giussani's students say one of his central messages was the inconceivability of the lone Christian. Okay, so evidence from a biological perspective that we need community. So we're built for community and relationships, and we can't escape this. Relationships influence the brain more than any other factor, more than drugs, more than what we eat, whether we meditate or not, whether we exercise, whether we're challenged physically. And there's many converging lines of evidence that have shown this. It was powerfully illustrated in 2 meta-analyses conducted by Julianne Holt-Lundstad. One was published in PLOS Medicine, and the other in Perspectives in Psychological Science. And for those of you who don't know, a meta-analysis, it's a really powerful tool. What it does is it lets you combine lots of different types of research that have high quality, reliable data and combine them to sort of look at trends across a whole set of research. So what she was able to show was she found that those with strong social relationships are 50% less likely to die prematurely than people with weak social relationships. The impact of lacking social connection on reducing lifespan is equal to the risk of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It's greater than the risk associated with excess alcohol, obesity, and lack of exercise. And lack of relationships is associated with a huge number of things: high blood pressure, coronary heart disease, stroke, dementia, lower quality sleep, lower immune function, more impulsive behavior, poor judgment, depression, and anxiety. Okay, so how is this mediated? There's a lot of different mechanisms, but the one that I'm particularly interested in and focus on is the workings of the brain and the central nervous system. So how relationships influence the way your brain works, how your cells are physically connected, how good they are at talking to each other, how often you generate new nerve cells, and how long you keep your brain cells working are all down to relationships and community. So we've demonstrated this in our own work at the cellular level, where we've seen that social ties in animal models influence the birth of new nerve cells. And we've taken that all the way up to studies with humans, where we've seen that relationships determine how synchronized our internal timekeeping mechanism is and how well our immune system functions. So it surprises people sometimes, I think, as when I talk about characteristics like relationships or community influencing the number of new nerve cells that animals generate. And that's because they tend to think of the brain as a static place, but it's far from it. It changes all the time. So both the anatomy and the physiology of your brain. And it's not just through development, it's something that's happening all the time. There's the well-known concept of plasticity in the nervous system, such that reorganization and strength of neural connections are changing based on use and experience. And that's really important. So this has really huge consequences as we have to realize that the situations we put ourselves in and our behavior has the power to influence and directly change the way that our brain works. So I really love talking about this stuff, and I would be really pleased to answer questions on any of these kinds of concepts that let the brain change, things like myelination and reorganization of gray and white matter and neurogenesis and regulation of gene activity and changes in network strength. So some of you may know about those mechanisms, and some of you may not, but I'm happy to answer questions on those as well. Okay, so why do we need community? We're healthier when we're around others. So we're really ultra social. And what's important is what takes you out of the experience of being separate. So things like not having social support is interpreted as chronic stress. So in times of stress, what happens is what's known as our autonomic nervous system. The parasympathetic branch, which is, you've maybe heard of the fight or flight survival mechanism. So you're presented with a predator and you need to survive. So you're either going to fight that predator or you're going to fly away. And what that does is that activates your nervous system. So it enables quick activation in life-threatening situations. With chronic stress, the problem is that stays continuously active, and there's no opportunity for your body to return to a state of rest. We see that when we are around others, when we are surrounded by other people, we are less likely to have that overactivity of the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system. When we lack our social ties, we can see constant overactivity of that. So our brains work better together. We know that it's really interesting, listening and participating in a conversation is actually less mentally taxing than listening to a monologue. So we think, oh, we're just sitting here, and maybe for some of you, I suppose it depends on whether you're resting and how much you're paying attention. But when you're listening and trying to concentrate on a monologue, that's more difficult and more taxing on your brain than conversing with someone. So we learn better by interacting than by observing. And that's there's a lot of different ways that this works. A couple of them that are interesting. In conversation, we subtly mimic people that we're speaking to, and we do that physically. So it helps us not only figure out what they're feeling, but it helps us mirror those feelings within ourselves. So we'll be talking to somebody and they'll smile a little bit, and we start to subtly mimic and move the muscles on our face so that we're smiling. And that helps us to understand and to be empathetic and understand what they're feeling. And there's some interesting studies with tetrodotoxin, with Botox, people who have that some people have that injected into their face to decrease lines and wrinkles. And what it does is it doesn't allow them to make as many facial expressions. And there's evidence that can interfere with their social relationships and with their communication skills. And that people report sometimes not being as comfortable speaking to them. And some of it is because they're not doing this mimicry. They don't move their muscles in the typical way. Okay, so there's also, there's evidence that most people make social ties under most conditions. And why would that be? There's this thing called the social baseline theory in evolution. So if you think, like, for millions of years in the history of our evolution, if we were excluded from the group, we would be likely dead, right? So through our evolution, we have had to work together. We've had to work together to build shelters, to find food. Being excluded from the group could have huge, huge consequences. So being together is important. They even find studies simply holding someone's hand. They'll have someone in an MRI machine and they'll be experiencing little small shocks. And both the anticipation of the shock and the rating of the pain is lower if they're simply holding hands with somebody. And that the strength of that response is even greater if it's someone who they have a personal relationship with. So there's real strong reasons how we work better together. Psychologically, we prefer companionship. So there was a great paper recently in Nature Neuroscience looking at animal models of drug addiction. And what they found was that social interactions can really have a profound effect on drug self-administration and relapse. So what they found was that rats will robustly choose peer contact over drug access. And that's even when they're in a physiological addicted state. So rather than existing on their own, if they can only make one choice, they will choose contact with other animals. When we're around people, we grow. It can literally change how we see the world. It changes our perspectives. And that's because we're changing the patterns of the connections of our brain cells. We're changing the transcription of our genetic material. So without true relationship, we can clamp down and really deaden our emotion centers. And that means that those regions won't be available fully to be able to respond. So you might think you want to try to deaden down on your negative emotions, but because this pathway from these deep limbic center areas of your brain are connected to your higher brain areas, that pathway, if you try to dampen it down so you're not feeling negative emotions, you don't feel, you can't dampen it selectively. You can't dampen your emotions selectively. So if you don't allow yourself to feel pain, the pain of relationships and the pain of trying to live in community, you can't experience full joy either. Okay, so I'm saying it's not all easy. So you have to be able to feel both the pain and the highs and the lows. And community can be hard and brotherhood can really challenge us. So it really forces ourselves out of ourselves. I think with our friends, we can risk becoming a clique, limiting to share our ideas and ways of doing things. We, just with people who think about things the way that we do, so we can risk locking ourselves in an echo chamber. And I think within intentional communities or groups, so people that you would meet maybe with your through your Catholic faith, you're going to meet people who are quite different from you. And we're called to go out of ourselves more and really to love others who are not exactly like us and don't see everything the same way that we do. Some years ago, the then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger warned against the concept of communion, which is the avoidance of conflict becomes the prime value. So, and I think that's really interesting. I think we can fall into that trap and draw back from communion because there can be conflict. I think that families are known for unity and also for disagreements. But as long as we have before us at all times the common faith, we shouldn't really fear the conflict that comes from faith exchange. And I think a good example of that was a friend in the States who's been ordained and living in his parish house for about 10, 15 years. And when his state was going into lockdown, the diocese sent 3 seminarians his way to stay with him for a couple months of lockdown. And he commented a few weeks into the lockdown that he was sure that everyone who lived on their own was not as holy as they think they are, showing that community, even in religious communities, isn't always easy. Okay, so we all know we can feel alone even in the midst of scores of people. So the evidence is that that a lot of us can feel this way a lot of the time. So there's a recent UK survey of students, over 7,000 participated. And one of the questions really struck me on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the least satisfied and 10 being the most. They were asked, how satisfied are you that you have community? And 50 to 75% were a 5 or below. So 50 to 75% of the people were saying that they didn't know if they had community or they didn't have experience of community. So what are the characteristics of strong community and relationship if we want to try to have that? We've heard a little bit about the biology, but what does the evidence show we need to have strong community and relationship? What bonds people, what makes healthy friendships and builds trust? There's themes that emerge. And what we see is these relationships need to be uplifting, consistent, and transparent. So uplifting, the data is showing about positive and negative. So you can have both positive and negative interactions when you're in community. And it's not a hard and fast rule, but a lot of the data shows you need significantly more positive interactions than negative. That shouldn't be that surprising. And actually the ratio from a lot of the studies is about 5 to 1. So part of this is because we have a really strength of emotion in memory. So, and as a lecturer, I know how this works because you give a lecture and you have 10 students who come up to you and say, oh, that was a great lecture, loved it, and give you really positive feedback. But one comes on and says, I fell asleep, it wasn't really very good. And so you can imagine, what am I thinking about for the next 2 days is the one student who wasn't engaged, not about the 10 students who felt that they had a good experience. And that's because we have the strength of memory and really the strength of negative comments. Because again, if you think in evolution, if you were getting negative feedback about something, what it meant was that there was a chance that your group wasn't going to invite you to play and wasn't going to invite you to stay with them, right? And you need community, and so it's built into our evolution over many, many years. Okay, consistency. And this literally takes time and repetition. So it's something that you have to make time for. And that's because we need to be able to pick out patterns and form new connections that we can strengthen. And they're strengthened. So you'll see people, you'll start forming new connections in your brain because of that relationship. And you need to take the time and put the time in to see those people so that those connections are strengthened and it can feel restful and be restful for you. Okay, so transparency. So I said, uplifting, consistent, and transparent. So we have to feel that we're telling the truth. And that's, a lot of us feel like we're wearing masks quite a lot of the time. And this is really important because the evidence really suggests that many of us are not transparent or feel known, even in a lot of our close relationships. So I mentioned Giussani before, and he says community does not necessarily bring out the best in us, it brings out the worst. And when we're an intentional community, we're together when we're being good and when we're not so good and no one is running away. And that's something that's really key to our ability to be transparent. People who are going to be there for us, and that there's an intention to be transparent and vulnerable, and people will still choose to be there with us. So we don't necessarily need more people in our lives. It's about having these themes overlap. So these themes of uplifting, consistent, and transparent. So we need to try to move more people into the zone where we have all three of those. So when we don't have that, we're lonely and we lack community. But we can develop these like muscles if we work at it to make our communities more uplifting, more consistent, and more transparent. But there are things that are going to get in the way of that. So what can get in the way of positivity? We need to work at uplifting others. Releasing neurochemicals is important to our well-being, and that's what happens when we're positive with people. So there's a suite of neurochemicals: serotonin, oxytocin, dopamine. You may have heard of some of those. They determine some of the strength of emotion and memory, as well as helping us to maintain our good mental health and positive mood. And do you make your relationships more positive by being restful and playing together? Pope Francis in 2015 at the Chrism Mass homily centered on people thought was a curious theme, proper rest. And I think given the many challenges we face, this might seem like a trivial topic, but in my opinion, I think it was right on the money. Greater stress needs to be addressed by proper rest and fun. Okay, so transparency. That requires vulnerability. So I'm thinking about things that that are getting in the way, right? So it requires vulnerability, and this is scary. And I think it's a particularly scary time maybe to be transparent. So we're probably all familiar with intellectual and popular culture icons in our time and have seen the cost of them making a mistake or standing up for something that they believe in. There's evidence that we're increasingly anxious about making our views known in a time of cancel culture where one misstep in language or behavior can result in permanent exclusion. So from an evolutionary point of view, again, we know the importance of fitting in with the group and the importance of being invited to play. So exclusion is something that we really feel viscerally. It has great impact and can really add to our reluctance to be transparent. So the biggest barrier to vulnerability we know is shame. And young people today are often told that they are not enough. And it's interesting when I talk to mixed groups. So for women, shame triggers are everywhere. You spend too much time on your appearance, shame. You don't spend enough time on your appearance, shame. You're too fat, shame. You're too thin, shame. You're too smart, shame. You're too stupid, shame. So women have a lot of trained shame triggers. Typically, men have basically one shame trigger. So you can try to fill it in your head and tell me after if it worked for you. Men do not want to appear to be, and then I leave a blank. And usually if I'm in a group that speaks back, overwhelmingly the audience says men do not want to appear to be weak. And that's really the idea. If people knew you were weak, they would run away. And that's not really what the data shows. The data really shows that consistently sharing and vulnerability is interpreted as courage by other people. So the fear that people have of making themselves vulnerable really isn't borne out by the data. Shame is highly correlated with addiction, depression, violence, abuse, suicide, bullying, aggression. And it's interesting because conversely, guilt is inversely correlated with these outcomes. So the difference from a psychological point of view, guilt is I have done bad, shame is I am bad. So what those definitions do is that puts you in a position where you can do something about. Guilt is something where you can take control. So you can take action on guilt. So guilt is good. Shame is I am a bad person. And that's really the thing that seems to prevent people from being vulnerable. That's the biggest factor. That people will not be able to accept you for who you are. So what does shame feel like? Shame feels like trauma. That's how people describe it. And the antidote to shame is empathy. So we dissipate shame by speaking aloud, and you need other people to display empathy. So not necessarily to say, I've done that, what you've done, but we've all done horrible things and thought horrible things. So it's not necessarily I have done that, but I can imagine because I have done things that are like that or worse. So how does this work on a biological level? The idea, one of the things that comes into play here is things called mirror neurons. So they're cells in your brain that are activated in response to seeing physical action that people are doing. So they mirror what other people are feeling. So it's like if you see someone in a film and they're punched in the gut and you kind of go, ugh, and you can feel it. You feel it viscerally in your gut. And we all have these. And the theory says that this really forms, the basis of empathy and is what's behind recognizing that other people are being courageous when they're revealing things about themselves. And the fact that we judge people as being more courageous when they are revealing things about themselves. Okay, so practical ways to encourage community, tying it into our Catholic faith. As I said before, we don't necessarily need more people. We need more people to move into the zone where we have this positivity, consistency, and transparency. And we're really most effective in groups. So it's really important to see how we can do this, and our Catholic faith is great at doing it. So the Mass is a fantastic way, liturgy and community building. And there's a couple pieces of recent data that have really kind of solidified my thinking here. There's been work on brain-to-brain synchronization among individuals performing coordinated tasks together. And this has really been shown to facilitate pro-social behavior. And pro-social behavior are things like helping, sharing, donating, cooperating, volunteering. A great paper in social and cognitive and affective neuroscience. Second, there's the role of physical movement has been really highlighted. And this comes back to us as creatures and physical beings, which is really important to us in our Catholic faith. Prior physical synchrony has been linked to interbrain synchronization and again, facilitation of social bonding. So these two things really highlight, some of the ways the Mass really works at a neurobiological level to enhance community. There's also data on music, which is really interesting. And I was Somebody said a talk that I gave previously said, well, it only if the music is good. But I suppose that's up for debate as to what you think music is good. So prayer, together and scheduled, and even intercessory prayer is really important. So you asking people for prayer, and that's because we think that the way that we solidify our relationships is by doing things for other people, but actually what solidifies your relationship more strongly, is by asking people to do something for you. So asking people for prayer, not only do you get the prayer, but it helps to solidify the relationships. Opportunities to learn and study together. So things like groups where you learn together, like this group, book clubs, studying biblical texts together, retreats, things that you work, and opportunities to learn and study together in small groups. And we know from some of the communication data that you're talking 3 to 5 people is really an ideal. So out of a larger group, if it can be broken into smaller groups of 3 to 5 people, that's really where your ease of conversation and your rest in the brain can be most strongly seen. When you start to get above 5 people, conversation can start to be taxing again on the brain. Accountability, often with real transparency and vulnerability in these groups. So here I say play. Play is really important, and we know that animals will work for opportunities to play. And some elements of competition can be good as well. And it's the whole area of animals and play is really interesting. Again, animals will work really hard, and they'll actually even handicap themselves in play to extend the time that they're able to play. So if one animal is dominant and is winning all the time, it will allow the other animal, it's a ratio, I don't know, it's like 4 to 1, I think. They have to let the other animal win once every 4 times for it to continue playing, and they'll happily do that. So there's 2 pictures at the bottom of hockey and ping pong, and that's actually in our Catholic chaplaincy in Glasgow. Oh, and this one I put in, this is from the Scots College in Rome. So we have Joshua Moore, who's a seminarian there in the brown hat, and we have Martin Eckersley in the collar, who's just been made a deacon, and they have their small Nerf guns. And on the other side, you can see Edward Toner with his larger Nerf gun. And I sent this on to Father Ross Campbell, who's going to speak to you next week, because Edward is from Glasgow, and Martin and Joshua are from Edinburgh, and he sent back to saying, therein lies the difference between Glasgow and Edinburgh seminarians in the size of the guns. So, okay, so meals are great. We have sharing food and drink is super important. I mentioned before about neurochemicals that help to really facilitate our elevated mood. Serotonin is really important in that. You might have heard of SSRIs, serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors. They're used to treat depression. Well, you can release serotonin yourself without an SSRI by sharing meals with people. You actually release more serotonin in your gut than you do in your brain. So sharing food and drink is really great ways to support community. And again, you can see if you look, you can see Father Ross, you'll recognize him next week. He's the one with the collar and the glasses halfway down the table in black. And so this is again from our Catholic chaplaincy. We don't share meals so close now. Okay, examine ourselves and our relationship. Give thanks is another thing we can do. So examining ourselves and our relationships in community. Saint Ignatius believed that gratitude was among the highest of the virtues. And the data is really clear that while individuals typically exhibit differences in how much they demonstrate and express gratitude, it's something that can really be cultivated. And this can have real social benefits for community. So the idea is that with intention, gratitude moves from being a temporary experience to a dispositional state. And it involves the recognition that there's an external source for positive outcomes. So brain imaging data shows that even when individuals complete tasks to make them think and concentrate on gratitude, even when it's assigned, so they have to do it in an experiment, it stimulates some expression of gratitude and produces changes in the frontal cortex region that increases future sensitivity to individual experience of gratitude. And that it's maintained even when it's not reciprocated. So even when the person that they are expressing gratitude for does not reciprocate to them. And it dampens rumination on negative emotions like anger, envy, and resentment. We also know that expressing gratitude is great not only for those with poorer mental health, but is also a benefit to the healthy population. So there's changes not only in our, the sort of outer regions of our brain that sort of have some of our higher executive functions, but there's also changes deep in the brain in areas like the hypothalamus. So that's one of my favorite brain areas because it houses the biological clock, which is where I started my studies of the brain. It controls things like sleep, eating, drinking. So there's clear biological pathways for, the improvements that are seen in the metabolic pathways by this expression of gratitude. Increases the brain chemical dopamine. So I spoke about that suite of neurochemicals that can be are really important to support our positive emotions. Dopamine participates in reward circuits. So in the most simple sense, it helps us initiate action in order to get that hit of reward again. Okay, so this is the stuff I'm talking to you about is important. It's not messing around. It's not some icing on the cake. We talked about the real consequences of not living in community, which are really strong, really working against the proper ordering of human nature. So one last thing I want to talk to you about, I say the elephant in the room. So COVID has had a real impact on our ability to work together and to strengthen community. So I would really relish those opportunities for strengthening smaller numbers of relationships. So remember, most of us don't need more people. We need more people to move into the zone where we can experience true transparency. And I would say don't discount social media. Now, I know there's dangers and drawbacks, but there is also huge potential. So I think many in our community, many of you here probably, were probably small children when the iPhone was released. So you've grown up with this technology, and I don't think we yet appreciate the ways that it can be used to be strengthen and solidify our relationships. So there are drawbacks from it, but I think that especially in this time, it's an option that we certainly can use. So we've done work with young people, in our own research, we've done work with young people in social media. And I can say certainly in Scotland, it's interesting. The young people use it to strengthen their face-to-face relationships and to facilitate their personal face-to-face relationships. So the idea of them having big communities of people that they don't really know isn't really the way that they're using it. So I think we need to try to take advantage of the in-person situations that we can have right now, but I wouldn't discount using media and technology where it can support. So another quote from Ratzinger, I'm coming to a close here. Faith confers community, vanquishes loneliness. He who believes is not alone. Today, when natural communities have broken up and the walls of isolation have become higher and higher, human beings need community more than ever before. So I think really, technologically, our ability to communicate is unprecedented, and we feel like we can do anything. We have a culture of self-creation at our fingertips. But this doesn't satisfy. Man's heart is made for community, and that's because God himself is a community of persons. So the communion, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, intertrinitarian relationships are at the heart of our faith. So our communities and relationships should be examples, especially as we look forward to emerging from this pandemic. There has been a hunger for community, and it's only going to be greater, and it's really increasing. So I really believe faith is spread by jealousy. Personal relationships are formed and people want what you have. And one of those things is community. So I'd like to come back to the idea of the inconceivability of the lone Christian. So within my reflection on community, I see it as absolutely essential and built into our very fabric. I've come to the conclusion that we need each other to get to heaven. We're not strong enough to do it as individuals. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Professor Stephany, that was brilliant. That was really, really interesting. Thank you for that. We're now going to take some questions. For those of you who are in the room, in the Newman room, please wave your hand at Joseph if you have a question. Joseph is probably walking around now waving at you as well. So send over your questions to Joseph and he's going to send them to me. And for anyone watching on the live stream, Joseph will also be attending to those and I will have them sent to me and read them out. But first of all, I have a question. So, Professor Stephany, you said that mirror neurons are activated when we observe action. So what can we as the church, the body of Christ, do to act on that and to share our faith in a way that might inspire others?
With thinking specifically of mirror neurons, I mean, I think it's being an example in everything you do and everything you say in your actions. And like I said at the end, the idea, I really think that faith is spread by jealousy. I really think it is. I think that people want to see what you have in community. People will see what you have in community, and they will want that. So I think them seeing and then people experiencing semblances of that or experiences of that in their mind based on what their mirror neurons are doing will make them desire that and want that.
So we need to be as joyful as possible in what we do.
Yes.
Okay. While I'm waiting for any questions to come through from Joseph, I'd also like to ask, what do you think is the biggest threat in an individualist society? How can we avert individualism?
Oh, I don't know what I would say is the biggest threat, because there's lots of threats. I guess the threat that's been on my mind the most recently, I guess, is sort of really polarization. Polarization in our society, I think, really is a huge problem. And I think that is something that's really increased by social media. And I think at the root of that is a lack of community. And that's because we don't, well, at the university, because I'm dean for learning and science. So we're trying to think about how we can, what kind of students do we need to turn out to the world? What skills do they need? And we've been talking about skills. We think, data science is really important, people being able to look at data and people to be able to talk about data. So how you can argue and debate constructively and use data, right? And I was thinking, oh, we're getting all this together and this program together for students, and that's really great. And then I remember thinking, but what we're missing out of it is this element of community and relationship, because if you don't feel that you have any bond, if you don't have any way of identifying with other people, you assume that there's a bias, a cognitive bias, where you assume what you are doing is out of love. So for love of country or love of your community, and you assume that other people are driven by hate. And even if you have examples, people who are maybe in your family or people who you know who are in that other group, you attribute their behavior to them being the exception to that group. It doesn't make you more aware of that group. So you have to try to find ways for people to have commonness in their relationship, in their community, before you can start to get them to talk to each other constructively. And I think polarization is one of the biggest dangers moving forward, I guess. That was a very long answer. I'm sorry. I've been thinking a lot about that.
That was great. Thank you. So we've got the first question coming from the group. How does community and relationships and knowing people are praying for you affect the recovery of people who have reduced brain function, for example, victims of stroke?
Grace. I would say, if someone is, that's probably the major way. I'm sure that's the major way that praying is working. From a community point of view, the fact that other people are supporting you and you know that other people are viewing you as a value to pray for you is very meaningful and very uplifting. But the value of grace in prayer, I think, trumps that.
No, I would agree. Thank you. Next one's just coming in. What would you say is the role of community within universities as coronavirus, the situation continues? How can we, particularly in chaplaincies, like you say, we have meals together, but that's coming to a close, and we have social media, but what can we do as a religious community?
Yeah, I think that where you can and where it's safe and where there's, you guys have good guidelines in place, I'm sure, like we do. So things like, participating where you can in face-to-face is good. But also keep in mind the idea that it's not necessarily the large elements of your community that you need to work on. People need to work on the strength of a smaller group of ties, I guess. So within I'm really in favor of, within your larger group, having intentional small groups set up. And I think even really on a practical level, I think having intentional small groups set up that support new members into your community. So to have intentional small groups, people who can meet together face to face, including people who are new into your community, to be supported by people who have been in your community for a few years, is a really great way. Well, now when you can only meet up in very small groups, I think that would be a real area of focus.
Thank you. I guess we have real responsibility to get to know our households as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, the next question is, so this person says, I appreciate the really scientific way you've approached this.
Well,
Do you have anything to say about the ways in which we build a spiritual communion, for example, prayer, the Eucharist, and how these relate to the ways in which we build a biological community?
So how we build
So a relationship between spiritual communion and biological community.
yeah, I mean, I think that I'm not sure exactly what's being asked, but I guess if I think about a spiritual communion and I think about a spiritual communion as opposed to an actual, so actually going for physical communion, I think solidarity with people, how it builds solidarity with people in the community who, because of their situation, because of their living situation, or because of their physical situation, can't partake in physical communion. The spiritual communion will help us to be able to be in solidarity with those people who can't have a physical communion, if that's what they're asking.
I hope so. I'm afraid I can't check, but
I'm probably better answering questions on the side. You have to ask the theological questions to your priest.
Okay. The next one is, given that you said that group size is so important and that we best learn from interaction, should we be changing the way we shape our community?
I think the strongest thing that people can do in communities is to make sure that they have small groups within a larger group. I think that's super important. So I think that's important for your faith community. And it's certainly something, I feel so fortunate in a position in my role at the university where I can influence things strategically. And we've been really, trying to work on the idea of working with these within small groups, because we have students who are coming new to the university who don't know, have never, don't know people at all, and trying to put them into a number of small groups, 2 or 3 small groups of 3 to 5 people, so that they have those kind of ties and they can really use that to support themselves. And it's something I've really, I do some work with I'm one of the scientists on the infection control group for the Bishops' Conference in Scotland, and have been working, giving some advice to churches and to the chaplaincies. And that's one of the things that I've been talking about, is trying to foster small groups within a larger group, because I think we have to be transparent, and to be transparent in a large group is really important. So you have to be transparent with a small group first, and learn to trust those people, and for that to become restful for you before you can consider doing that in a larger domain.
Thank you. And we've got one question here from the YouTube. Peter says, do you think that there is anything uniquely advantageous in faith communities that sets them apart from other forms of community?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think there's so many things. I mean, I think that we have the common bond in our culture, and the faith that we have, and the bond that automatically gives to people who can be very different from us, I think is really strong. Because I think communities in general search for common elements to bind them together. And we're overrun with common elements that bind us together. So I think that's huge. And the examples that I was giving about things within the Catholic faith that help to build community. So things like just the physical act, we are physical creatures, and going to the Mass and participating in those rituals together, and participating in the sacrifice of the Mass together, those things are absolutely invaluable for binding us together as a community. So we are so fortunate and start off miles ahead of other groups that are trying to form community.
Yeah, wonderful. I think we've just got one more question. to this person. They also say, thank you for such an enlightening and super relevant talk. We now have a very scientific outlook on behavior and the brain. It seems as though many of your community-based decisions are subconscious. After seeing the neurological benefits of these decisions, many of us may resort to making more of these decisions based on knowing said benefits. My question is, when someone is more conscious of the benefits of communal establishment, do their actions bear the same neurological benefits, or are they less effective because they tend to be more mechanical and contrived?
Oh, that's a really good question. Really good question. Not really. No, they don't. We tend to, the physical act of doing things is really important. And I think that that's something that's super important that we get from our Catholic faith as well. The physicalness of us as creatures is really important. So I guess just one of the examples I gave the example of the gratitude studies, where people, even though they were given tasks to do, to say, okay, you have to be grateful to this many people, you have to think of these many things to be grateful for. Even the people who were doing it just in the context of an experiment, knew they were doing it in the context of an experiment, still showed the brain changes, and they were still put in a situation where they were able to be more grateful in the future, moving forward. So I think that because what you're doing, your actions, your physical actions, change the way your brain works. So I think that, I don't think that it's the doing that's important. So it's not just thinking about it. So you've thought about it, and that's good, but now you have to do something about it. And when you actually do something about it, you're changing and laying down patterns in your brain that are going to facilitate and make it more likely that you make those choices in the future. So, I think it's all big.
Thank you. That was a great question as well, I have to say. I think that's all of them. I'll just double check the YouTube again. Well, I think that's all the questions. But thank you very, very much. I'm sure you're getting a round of applause in the Newman room.
Excellent.
And
enjoy Father Ross Campbell coming next week. He's an excellent speaker, so you will enjoy him as well, I'm sure.
Thank you.
You're being invaded by Scots this year.
We are a little bit.
Well, I'm not Scots, obviously, but I am in that direction.
Thank you so much. And for those of you who are in the Newman room now, I'm sure we'll be moving to Compline in just a few moments. But for all of you that are there, please give Professor Stephany a round of applause, even if we can't hear you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.